guys, it's Nikki here. I'm here today to do the World War Z movie review. It's the paired review to go with the book review I did last week. There will be spoilers in this video. I can't really talk about the differences between the book and the movie without mentioning some of them, so if you have not watched the movie or have not read the book, or both, you might want to click off the video. In the comments below, I will include my spoiler-free review and the spoiler-filled book review. So how this movie review works is I review the movie, I do a summary, likes and dislikes, and then I'll give it 2 scores. The first score will be what I thought of the movie by itself, and the second score will be the book to movie transition score. So the summary of this is the same as with the book. It follows basically the fall of civilization with this zombie war that's going on. However, in the movie, you start at the Great Panic. You don't really start with some interviews leading up to the Great Panic and some of the cover-up that was included. Specifically, you follow one character. You follow Jerry, who's played by Brad Pitt, which honestly is probably a pretty good casting choice. He did a very good job. And you follow him as he travels the world in order to solve the origin of the Zika virus, as they're calling it, or to aid in finding a cure. He does all of this after he gets his family to safety because of his ties from his previous job. They do touch on various milestones from the book, such as Israel, the doctor and the potential patient zero. They also talk a little bit about how airplanes were transporting the sick because they weren't showing, in the beginning at least, they weren't showing symptoms right away. And then you also have the use of like aircraft carriers and a lot of people in the ocean and using those as zombie-free zones. And they also mention some of the free zones that are on land. However, despite this, they really don't include a lot of material from the book, which is a little disappointing, but also understandable. And all of this is going on with Jerry traveling to Israel and talking to these people about their plans and patient zeros and the role of airplanes and boats and stuff in the issue. As you typically would get, you get zombies interfering with his progress in a variety of ways, either by attacking where he's at, having attacked where he's at, or having attacked the people he's looking for. Eventually, he does kind of figure out what to do to help humanity based on what he's seen throughout his travels. It's not necessarily a cure, but it's a solution. And honestly, I kind of call it like a MacGyver solution. It's something that he works up and may not necessarily be the best solution, but it's what works. The last thing I'm going to say, kind of to summarize the movie here, is they did try to do the world view and the shared experience, which was really nice. They did this by doing the multiple locations and all of the traveling that he had to do. However, as expected, they didn't really do it as good as the book, just because of how the book format and the movie format were different. So now that I've summarized kind of the movie here for you, I'm going to go into a little bit more depth by talking about my likes and dislikes. Unlike my previous movie review, there are a lot more likes than there were before, and I didn't get as wound up by the changes. If you are interested in seeing that one, I will include the link below as well for my Ready Player One movie review, but honestly, you can just skip it. So for World War Z, my likes and dislikes included many different things. I'll start with my likes. I really appreciated that in the beginning, during the Great Panic, and while the threat level is so high, that they have Jerry's wife stay cool under pressure, and they don't have her fall into this typical panic trope that you get with a lot of females, where they crack under this pressure and end up doing a bunch of dumb things. I really like that they didn't do that. Anything that was done that I would consider kind of like a stupid move were all done by the kids, and that makes a lot more sense. They're really the ones that are more likely to let their fear overwhelm them. The other thing I like is they have Jerry take precautions for the most part. You see this in the way he kind of shields himself before he goes to interact with any of the zombies. And you see this in the way that he kind of thinks out where he's going to go next, and that he makes the active decision to go somewhere rather than just hoping for the best. And one of the other things I enjoyed was that they did attempt to do a worldview, and they did this with lots of having Jerry do lots of traveling to really emphasize the pandemic's proportions. And they had him going from the States and off the coast of the States to South Korea and Israel and all of these other places in order to try to find the source and cure. And although it doesn't do it as well as the book does, I really was impressed at how they attempted to do it, because it did still show the global scale, even if it didn't quite emphasize the shared experience of the pandemic. Next, I'll move on to a disliker. And this is actually my biggest dislike with the movie. They changed the zombies, and they changed them too much. I would say they took creative liberties with how they had the zombies set up. In the book, the zombies are slow and mindless, and the reason they're so terrifying is because they're strong, because they feel no pain, so they never know when they're over exerting themselves to use muscles, and their numbers are so overwhelming that that's what makes them scary. And in the movie, they made them really like these more like driven, mindless predators. They were too active, and they tended to swarm the way bugs swarmed, which is to say the zombies in the books did this too. However, the zombies in the movie, their actions were much too intentional because they could have them running, climbing, jumping, grabbing. Their actions required too much thought for what the zombies in the book had set up. Because the zombies in the book, when they grabbed at you and stuff, it was more because whatever stimulus was required told them there was food nearby. And whenever they grabbed you, it was more of like oh, your hand came up against something, now you're gonna grab it. Whereas here, they're actively like clenching at stuff, and they're grabbing for specific things. They're not just kind of grabbing in the direction of the stimulus. And that resulted in a lot of them like jumping onto helicopters, which was no. And it had them climb over the wall in Israel, which didn't actually happen. And they did it because they could run, jump, climb, and they swarmed in a way that the zombies from the book did not, which unfortunately changed their threat style. And because of that change, it resulted in other changes throughout the book, kind of with a cascading effect of their threat level. They also changed. Another negative for me is that they changed the format from the book. And while I understand the reason for this, because the format of the book would not have fit well in a 1.5 to 2 hour movie for the silver screen, it did make me kind of upset because I'm sure there are ways they could have done it and kept the format that worked so well in the book. But while I understand the change, I still consider it a dislike because I did enjoy the format from the book so much. Next, kind of the above 2 points I talked about, the change in the zombies and the formatting in the book, really resulted in a change of tone, especially with the zombie changes, because you get this change from fear and predators and this desire to find the cure, to beat them back and to kill them. And while you get that in the book, just like it feels more like this general fear of a predator because of how active and how high of a threat level the zombies are. In the book, while there was fear, I found like the underlying emotion to it was that it was just this overwhelming hopelessness. And while the zombies were a large threat, the threat level came more from the fact that there was an overwhelming number of them. Their number was too great to go through and kill in one fell swoop. And especially at the beginning in the book, they didn't have the right weapons and strategies to deal with them because they were trying to fight against them like they were humans rather than these undead. And the movie, although it does show some of this, they don't touch on it in the same way. And especially at the end, where they're like, look, we're rah, 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 we're overcoming the zombies. They used a bunch of these strategies, techniques, and weapons that in the book had proven not to work because they didn't do enough damage to the brain. So for me, that was kind of a negative thing, just because that change in tone was it wasn't necessarily drastic change, but it made it very different, and the overall tone was different. It was actively scary rather than creepy with constant tension with scary flare-ups, which is what you got in the book. The other thing I'm going to touch on is the camouflage thing, using a terminal virus to kind of make you undesirable for consumption. And while this is a really cool concept, it wasn't in the book, which for me is kind of a negative because for how little they used from the book, that could have taken a lot more rather than needing to make stuff up. However, having this camouflage solution, it really did allow the movie to work and pace itself more effectively and wrap up well, because they weren't able to wrap it up the way the book wrapped it up. So it allowed them for this specific end goal, which allowed for a really good ending that was consistent with everything else in the story, or in the movie. It was consistent with everything else in the movie, and it allowed for a very specific ending, and you knew when it was the end because of this end goal. And like I said, it also allowed the movie to end without having to do too many references to how they would follow through in the recovery years to reclaim everything. So like I said, although I didn't enjoy the camouflage solution because it wasn't in the book, it worked well in the movie, which I really appreciated. The other thing that I wasn't crazy about was the fact that it started after the panic, kind of at the panic, rather than a little bit more before. And this isn't a major thing because although you did miss some of like the cover up and news and all this talk about rabies and a lot of the political maneuverings on the global scale, it did allow for really effective use of like the radio and the news coverage throughout. You see them always listening to the radio, or in the beginning he's watching the news on TV, and that allows you to get a minimal amount of information, which is enough to give you context before you meet the zombie initially. And that's it for my likes and dislikes. Now I'm going to kind of wrap up the review here and move on to my ratings. So it comes right down to, for me, was it a bad movie? No. It was a very enjoyable movie. I actually had a very good time watching it despite all the changes. That being said, was it a bad book to movie translation? And I would have to say yes. It's not the worst book to movie translation I've ever seen, but they weren't able to keep as much from the book that I had enjoyed as I would have liked, which actually leads me to my next point. I have a very specific idea of how I think this would have translated well to TV, and it is, instead of to do it as a TV series rather than a movie, that gives you the time you need to keep that interview style, and you could frame it as a docudrama, where you do kind of the introductory episode that kind of tells you what's going on and where they are, kind of like they do the introduction in the book. And then each episode could be a combination of one or more interviews, and it would just be you'd start with the guy sitting down with the interviewer in the same location they are in the book. And then once they get going a little bit, the rest of the episode will change to the flashback of the story the person's telling, and that will be the bulk of the episode. I think that would be awesome, and if you got Max Brooks in on it as well, there's a potential that you wouldn't need to just use information from his books. There's a possibility that he could give that extra insight to additional kind of filler information that isn't in the book. So that's really ideally what I would have seen. And I didn't, which is unfortunate, but if I could do it again, that's what I would do, is the TV series. So if you're going to watch this movie, I definitely would keep an open mind, because if you're going in expecting to get what you got out of the book, you will be disappointed, because it is nowhere near the same as the book. The movie, while good and did a good job of attempting to do all of the things the book did, it didn't quite hit the same note because they had to change the format. And understandably, it didn't translate well because it would have been so hard to keep that format from the book in the movie due to the time constraints of your typical movie. So that's really all I have to say about the movie. I'll move now into my ratings. As far as a movie unto itself, I'm giving it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. It was fun, it was action-packed, the tone was really nice, there was a lot of tension and fear. Even though the zombies would get kind of humorous sometimes, they do this weird like teeth clicking, nattering thing, but overall it was a pretty good experience. I've watched it a couple times and I really enjoyed it. The big thing for me with this movie is it wasn't just victory is emptying bullets into things, especially with the solution that Jerry's character comes up with. It is a bit of a thinking ending where it requires you to connect the same dots that he connects in the movie, and while they're fairly telegraphed, you do have to be watching for them. So like I said, as a movie unto itself, I give it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. In terms of a book to movie translation, its score is going to be much lower. And the big thing is that they did have to change a lot to fit it into the time constraints of the movie setup from the book. And although they did attempt to do a lot of the worldviews, they didn't really do as good a job of the worldview and kind of the global scale of the problem as the book did. So that detracted a bit from the experience for me as well. And then my final thing, and this is the most major thing that hurt the book for me, is they changed the zombies too much. And it changed the tone related to the zombies. And it resulted in situations that would not have occurred in the book, simply because they allowed the zombies too much intentional action, such as running, jumping, or climbing. So with that said, in terms of a book to movie translation, this movie gets a 1.5 out of 5 stars from me. It isn't the worst, and while there were enjoyable parts, they didn't keep enough from the book in for me to be able to say that it's a good book to movie translation. And that is it. If you haven't watched it yet and are interested, I will include the links below for the book review to go with this paired movie review. And otherwise, I will see you at the next video. Bye!